Warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our latest webinar on Talk with an Air Traffic Controller, presented by Sporty's Pilot Shop. Very delighted this evening to have Eddie Albert with us, a veteran air traffic controller, currently out of the Cincinnati International Airport. Has a wide range of experience, as we'll learn, and kind of a new presentation type for us this evening, more of a question and answer. And I really appreciate all the attendees, which we have over 3,000 registered. This will be a record for us here at Sporty's for writing in all the questions. Over 700 questions written in, which is very impressive, and a lot of insightful comments and interesting things we're going to talk about, all led by you, the customers and the attendees. Quick overview of how this is going to work this evening. Again, we've had 700 questions. We've gone through with Eddie, who I'll introduce here shortly, and we've arranged them into different subjects so that we can cover this in a methodical method. As you can imagine, many were duplicates, so you're probably going to hear your question answered one way or the other through Eddie's presentation and training topics, along with other attendees and their questions as well. Due to the high volume nature of this presentation and the large amount of attendees, you will find a question feature in your GoToWebinar software, but given the time constraints, we are going to limit this to the questions that were asked in advance. And I'm pretty sure, based on again the wide variety and content sent in by pilots in attendance this evening, your question will likely be answered throughout the presentation. A couple housekeeping items. We are recording this presentation, so again, a lot of information here. You'll be able to view that on Sporty's YouTube channel. It'll be up there tomorrow. You'll also get a follow-up link from Sporty's and GoToWebinar, this software, with information on that recording. There's also some digital handouts you'll see in your software that you can access. We put a couple up there from the National Air Traffic Control Association, NATCA. If you don't see those, don't worry. We have some links at the end of the presentation that will allow you to access those easily. And there's more than we have here alone in this presentation. We cannot hear you, we can't see you. You'll be able to hear us, you'll be able to hear Eddie. So sit back and relax, get comfortable, and enjoy an exciting and very informative informational presentation on air traffic control. So a little bit about our presenter, Eddie Albert, who I've known personally about 15 years now. Eddie's a quality control specialist at the Cincinnati, Greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Airport, also known as CVG. Very experienced in the radar operations, tower operations, ground control. An air traffic controller for over 38 years, having worked at Gainesville, Florida, Knoxville, the busy Daytona Beach with all the Embry-Riddle traffic, and now stationed here where we're located at Sporty's in the Cincinnati International Airport. Eddie's unique and brings a great perspective to this audience tonight because he's also a commercial pilot and a flight instructor, which is not that common in the air traffic control system, especially as the newer air traffic controllers come into the ranks. So Eddie has that insight of both the pilot and the controller, which really allows him to relate to us as pilots and understand the system a lot better. My name is Brett Kobe. I'm with Sporty's Pilot Shop. I'm also a flight instructor. And again, Eddie and I have worked together about 15 years producing various presentations, in-person webinars. Eddie also is a presenter in our instrument rating course, the Sporty's pilot courses, also sharing his knowledge of pilot training and how it relates to air traffic control. So again, very excited to have Eddie with us here this evening. Here's a quick overview of the subject matter we're going to be covering. And again, a lot of the questions, which was good to see, were similar in nature. So we're going to cover a lot of things here that a lot of pilots are interested in. I'm going to start off, of course, which is really a lot of people's top of their mind. How is ATC affected by the current pandemic and the slowdown of operations? We're going to talk about the ATC profession, how to become a controller, life as an air traffic controller, towered airport operations, Class B and C airspace operations, a lot of questions on how to deal with congested airspace, fast talking controllers, that kind of thing, and route considerations, especially how ADS-B affects the controller as opposed to the traditional old radar system. A little bit of IFR flying. Another hot topic that came up throughout the questions were VFR Flight Following, so we're going to cover that in depth. Some communication and phonetic tips. Pilots always want to know what the slang that controllers hate, but then also what can you get away with. So Eddie's going to share some real world advice on that. And of course, as pilots, we have concerns. What are the tolerances? What do we get in trouble for? So Eddie's going to share some real world advice on that. Eddie, welcome. How are you doing this evening?
Great, thank you very much.
Great, thank you for being here.
So COVID-19 is on everyone's mind right now. as far as GA flying, actually we encourage it right now because the commercial traffic is down so much. There are so few aircraft flying that we've been able to, of course, adjust our staffing. And what we've done is we've broken teams down into even smaller teams, and they're pretty much working 5 days on and then 10 days off because we don't need all the controllers. At Cincinnati, we have one tower controller and one radar controller on at a time, and the other people are usually on break unless we're having an increase of traffic. So there's always people to, staff the other positions, but for the most part, we only have one person in the tower and one person in the radar room. So over at Lunken, VFR Tower, Class D, they're actually doing more traffic than we're doing on a good VFR day. So great time to get out and do practice approaches, go to a busy airport that is no longer busy. If you ever wanted to land at an international airport, now's a great time to do it. As far as procedures routing, there's no changes unless a facility has someone that was in the facility that had COVID-19, and then they may shut the facility down for a while. In that case, you'll be routed around that facility's airspace, unless, of course, you were landing in the airspace, and then we will get you in there, but everyone else is going to be routed around the airspace. Now, if it's a center, that's a whole lot of airspace to have to go around, but we'll do it. But we usually keep you going to your destination. Tower may be closed or just be a VFR tower, but you would still be able to operate in and out of that airport, even though the tower was closed. So my best advice is keep on flying.
Let me ask you a question on that, because I've seen MBAA and a couple organizations point out when a sector, say from Indianapolis Center, was shut down, how can pilots become aware during their pre-flight if there is a shutdown facility or a shutdown tower or a shutdown sector, for example?
That should be in the NOTAMs.
Okay.
I would believe. Now with us being down staffing to one person, you're monitoring a whole lot more frequencies. So just be aware that the controller may be talking to aircraft that are not on your frequency, so you're not hearing the readback from the pilots.
Okay, that makes sense. I know we did some practice approaches over at Greater Cincinnati International Airport, which in Cincinnati is usually a very busy airport with a lot of the airline operations and DHL, Amazon freight, and the controllers are very accommodating to allow us to practice an ILS approach there in a given afternoon, something that we normally couldn't do. So definitely is a good time to get out there at those busier airports if you can and get some practice. I'm sure the controllers would like to appreciate the traffic as well. So let's switch gears here, talking about an air traffic controller. And we had a lot of interest among pilots, and I think, it's kind of a mystery profession because it's a person we really don't see very often, but we hear their voice on the radio. Talk a little bit about the process to become an air traffic controller and what that takes.
The best way to become a controller is to go through the military, be a controller in the military, and you're set up great to get into air traffic, although the military is asking for 5 or 6 years if you go that route. There are schools that you can go to, but unfortunately, they just usually give you a degree, and that's about it. There's a school in the Pittsburgh area, Beaver, which you'll actually get to work in a control tower and get your control tower operator's license, which then allows you to go to some Class D airports that are contract towers, and you could work there until you get hired by the FAA. But the main hiring pool is the general public. Once a year, we put out an announcement, and for a couple days, we accept applicants until we get overwhelmed with 5,000 or so applicants, and we only need 1,000 a year is what we're hiring right now. So you don't have to have any prior experience. I have 2 sons that are hired that they had no experience, and their father did not help them. And you just take the test, and if you do well, you move on to the next step, and you eventually end up going to Oklahoma City for about 3 months, and we teach you the basics. If you pass that, then you go on to your facility, and it's on-the-job training for 2 to 3 years. As far as visiting, I'm sorry.
Oh, is there any age limitations? I've heard in the past that there are some restrictions as far as during that window of what the age group is for the new controller hires.
Yes, you have to be 18, and you can be no older than 30 when you start the process.
Okay.
And then at age 56, you're too old, and we say you can no longer control traffic.
Okay. So again, pilots, no air traffic controllers is the mystery behind the radio. Do you encourage pilots to come visit air traffic control facilities?
Yes, I do. When I was in Daytona Beach, we had a program where the flight instructors were invited to come for 4 hours and just sit and watch what we do. And I was surprised at how few people actually took us up on that. Tours, we do give tours. It's, based on your facility. At Cincinnati, I always ask that they come with more than one person. Just don't come by yourself, because usually you'll take 7 people at a time. So share the experience with some other people. The 2 ways to get a tour: one, call the facility and talk to someone like myself, a support specialist. We're usually there between 8 and 4. Or you can call the facility directory, call them direct at the TRACON, and try and talk to someone there and see if they'll let you come visit a tour after hours or on a weekend.
Okay, I'm guessing right now with the current COVID situation, probably wait until this kind of moves on to get back into the towers and the kind of the tight group settings.
Correct. No tours are allowed right now.
So here's an interesting question. Might be more of a personal preference based on where you control. But one of the pilots asked, do controllers have an overall feeling that smaller or general aviation aircraft are a nuisance when they're already busy controlling airline traffic as they kind of work them into the system?
That kind of depends on the facility that you're working at. So here in Cincinnati, because jets were 90% of everything we worked, if you couldn't do 180 knots, then you were a little nuisance. However, there always were us that look at that as a challenge. How do I fit you into the sequence with all of these jets? So you may get a delay at a Class B airport just because if I have a line of 200 miles long of jets that have already asked to come to Cincinnati and you're just now calling me, you're going to go to the end of the line. But I think it's a challenge to fit the slower aircraft in with the faster.
Yeah, makes sense. And there's really no legal limitations. It's more of, like you said, a workload basis. And as controllers, you have a feel for how many planes are, like you said, en route to your facility. So Greater Cincinnati, at any given minute, you can see and have a feel, right, for how many inbound turbine aircraft are coming in.
Yes, we have a display that shows you as soon as you take off, if you're IFR, that you're coming to Cincinnati. So we know exactly how many aircraft are coming every 15 minutes.
Gotcha. So even though the frequency might not sound busy, you know that there could be an incoming, essentially herd of or a rush of traffic coming in.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. So I mentioned at the beginning, and I've met a lot of air traffic controllers, and I think you're the only one that I've met that's also a flight instructor, which I think is, again, why we can work so well together, and you appreciate the pilot side and the air traffic controller side. But when you're talking to center or approach control, is it common to have pilots be the controllers, or is that more the exception nowadays?
That's more the exception. I would say maybe 15% of the controllers actually fly, which is
Okay.
it's a hindrance because you have no idea what the pilot can do and what he can't do, and all you know is what you saw somebody else do, and so then you expect the next aircraft to do the same thing, and it could be a totally different situation.
Sure, and I just watched a recreation recently of a passenger landing at King Air down in Florida, and at that time, at the facility, I think it was Fort Myers Approach, they had no pilots, and they actually were able to call a King Air flight instructor to talk the passenger down. So I'm guessing that's more and more commonplace for those emergency scenarios to relay. So don't always assume that the controller is aware of your aircraft systems or the challenges that you might be dealing with on your aircraft, because they may have never stepped foot in a Cessna or a Piper before. Uh, Kind of another interesting behind the scenes questions, and this again is probably dependent on the facility, but say take the busiest controller, maybe in a Washington or a New York area. How many airplanes can one controller manage at one time?
That is a really good question. It all just depends on how many conflicts you have. If they're all lined up in a row, you know, 15 is easy. But if you got a thunderstorm and everyone's going out of your airspace, 5 may be too many. So it's a really hard thing to put an actual number on. If you're working at a place like a small approach control where you own a 30-mile radius around the airport, you have lots of airspace that you could have those aircraft spread out in. So you could work a whole lot more than someone who has maybe a 10-mile wide corridor that he has to keep his aircraft in. Your best controllers always say he can take one more.
Right, right. I can see that. And I imagine too, and the next question kind of leads into that. If you're vectoring a lot of aircraft, say for an approach versus a streamlined flow on a instrument arrival procedure leading into an instrument approach, in the Cincinnati area, I know you're vectoring a lot of traffic for Greater Cincinnati, for Lunken, for Claremont County. Does the vectoring aspect become challenging when you have to, give headings constantly because now you, the controller, are responsible for their direction? How does that affect your workload?
It is an increase in workload, which has gone down because of the RNAV arrivals. But it was just something you got used to. Once you have a line of traffic going, you just have your scan and you have your hot spots. It's like you're always going back to your attitude indicator in your scan on your cockpit. On the radar scope, the guy approaching the final, that's a hot spot because I got to make that turn precise. So I'm always going back to see where that aircraft is.
So constantly keeping a mental picture in your brain of what's going on along with what's on the scope. And we're going to show coming up here a little bit, we have some screens to show what the scope looks like so you can have a better feel for what Eddie's seeing and what the controllers are seeing. And that'll give you a better feel also for what the controller is seeing. Last question here on this subject. This is kind of a generic one. What are some things you wish you could tell pilots that would make your life easier as a controller, or any controller for that matter, that pilots can do to facilitate your demands?
For VFRs, it's listen on the frequency. It's so often we have someone call up for flight following, and 30 seconds later we go to issue traffic or ask a question, and they're not listening on the frequency. They've turned it down so they can have a conversation or just whatever. But just listening on the frequency and then telling us when you have a problem. Don't hide it. Let us know so that we can be of service, because we can't do anything if we don't know.
And I think that's a lot of fears of pilots in general, and we're going to cover that later on. And definitely one of my concerns is oversharing information and fear of retribution or deviation of some sort. And it's my understanding, you as a controller, that's the last thing anybody should be worried about. You want to disclose full information at any given time, and not worry about what if scenarios. Is that accurate, would you say?
Yes, it is. No controller wants me listening to their tape deciding whether or not they did the right thing or not. So we don't look to cause trouble. We just want you to get on the ground safely.
Yep, understood completely. Okay, we're going to move on to the next topic here, which relates to tower and ground operations. And Eddie has some slides here we're going to work through with some kind of key teaching points and hot topics related to his observations at Greater Cincinnati Airport to share with pilots.
One thing we teach controllers as they're arriving at the airport, start getting an idea of what the flow of traffic is at the airport. And you can do the same thing as a pilot as you arrive. Oh, the wind's out of the southwest, probably on runway 21. Oh, there's a guy over there doing touch and goes. Start getting an idea of what's going on at the airport. Then if you're leaving a Class B or C airport, you can go to the next slide, you're going to have to talk to clearance delivery. And you say a lot of times clearance delivery is combined to ground. Usually at the Bravo airports, it's not. Some of the Charlies are just for workload basis, but we need you to call clearance delivery. As you can see in the previous slide, Cincinnati, that highlighted in yellow area is the arrival airspace. And if you were leaving Cincinnati, you're going above 10,000 feet, you got to go out those red routes. I always suggest anybody leaving Cincinnati to stay below 10,000 feet to get clear of our airspace and then ask for higher, just to avoid the jet traffic that's going to be up there at the higher altitudes. But so you're going to go call clearance delivery. There are just some basic things that he needs to know. So if he's not going to be, he is expecting your call, but at the same time, he may have been sitting there for the last 20 minutes and no one's called him. So you want to wake him up and say, Cincinnati clearance delivery, Cessna 123 VFR request. So once he responds to you, we know he's awake now and he's got his pencil, he's ready to write. So then he's ready for your full call sign, your type aircraft, the ATIS information, and what your request is. I want VFR Flight Following to Lexington at 4,500. The reason you're doing this is so that he can put you in the computer so that you will get flight following at least in the immediate area and possibly to your destination. So if you say flight following, he's more likely to put you in all the way to your destination rather than if you just say VFR departure to the south, he's going to put you into the local system, which doesn't go beyond the immediate approach control. On the next slide then is the response that the controller is going to give you. Remember 260 Mike Golf, Cincinnati clearance delivery, cleared out of the Bravo airspace, fly runway heading, maintain 4,000, departure frequency 126.65, squawk 4410, expect runway 18 left. We almost always give runway heading just so that you don't turn immediately after you get airborne. Some people like to do that as soon as they rotate, they start a turn. And so clearance delivery usually tells you to fly runway heading. That allows the local controller then to issue whatever heading he would like to you once you get airborne.
Eddie, can I ask you a
yes.
quick question here? Is this applicable to both Class B and C airspace?
Yes, it would be. Now, facilities can be different. When I worked in Knoxville, we started off by turning everybody. We gave you the furthest heading that I could possibly get, and then local ended up telling you to fly runway heading, and we eventually changed it back and we told everyone to fly runway heading. So you're not always going to get runway heading. It's just most airports, they start off by saying fly runway heading at clearance delivery. The maintaining of 4, they say it's an IFR altitude. Well, you had requested 4,500. That's as high as I can give you at clearance delivery, so he gave you the 4,000. The transponder code tells me that he gave you a code that's going to allow you to talk to the center or other approach controls. As we go into the next slide, you'll see that each approach control is given a subset of beacon codes. So Indianapolis approach has 0300 codes, whereas Dayton or Columbus approach now has 0100 codes. Cincinnati has 04 something something. So if you got a code that starts with a 0, you probably got a code that's only good in that approach control's airspace. So here I normally ask, does anyone have questions? Unfortunately, we can't do that. So moving on to ground control. Best thing you can do to help ground control is don't call until you do 2 things. 1, be ready to taxi. Now I understand you get your route and you're going to want to look it up and see where you're going, but other than checking your route, everything else should be ready to go. Number 2, taxi out to the edge of the ramp. Don't block an entrance, but be out there towards the taxiway so you're ready to exit the FBO. This does 2 things for us. In the next slide, if you're at an airport that has deep T hangars, you could be way in the back where I can't see you from the tower, and you're saying you're at the T hangars ready to taxi. Well, I'm looking and I see a Cessna that's ready to that looks like he's ready to taxi, and I may assume that that's you when you're really way in the back there. So how can I taxi you if I don't know where you are and when you're going to enter the taxiway? Because there could be an aircraft getting ready to clear the runway, and 5 minutes after I told you to taxi, now all of a sudden you're coming off the ramp. So be at as close to the taxiway as you can get before you give us a call. And what do you say when you give us a call? You got the 3 W's: who you are, where you are, and what you want to do. So van 260 Mike Golf at Delta Air Elite, taxi for departure. Now, if you haven't already talked to clearance delivery, you now need to state what your direction is going to be, that you're eastbound, because I won't have a strip. But at the Class C and B airports, we'll have a strip already prepared, so ground control will know where you are going. Now, when I give you taxi instructions, I am required to give you the entire route unless there is a hold short instruction. If there is a hold short instruction, I'm going to give you the route up to that runway. So I would respond, runway 18 left, taxi via Mike and Mike 2, hold short of runway 27. You must read back the runway hold short instructions. As controllers, we don't care if you read anything else back, but you got to read back hold short instructions. You don't have to read back altitudes. You don't have to read back headings. You don't have to read back routes. You know, in fact, you can get an IFR clearance, and at the end you could say, Roger. And that's fine with us because what you read back is what you got as your clearance. So if you read nothing back, what I gave you is your clearance. However, if I told you to maintain 8 and you read back 6, 6 now becomes your assigned altitude. As in the taxi clearance, if I just read back, Roger, taxi to runway 18 left, you could taxi all the way to the runway. So I've got to come back and correct your read back. So very important, read back hold short instructions. Now, when I tell you to cross the runway, I'm required to state where to cross the runway. Now, you're sitting right there at Mike 2, but I still have to say cross runway 27 at Mike 2 and then give you further taxi instructions. If you're at all uncomfortable, ask for progressive taxi. So if you had asked for progressive taxi, I would have said runway 18 left, taxi via turn right onto taxiway mic. And then I'd look out the window and I'd see you turn on the mic, and then I'd say, turn left at mic 2, hold short at runway 27. So if anything happens, it's going to be my fault. Just never cross a runway without being told. And don't be afraid to say student pilot. Even if you're not a student pilot, go ahead and say you're a student pilot. No one knows. As far as crossing runways, we can only cross one runway at a time. In this diagram here, you got to cross 4 runways to get to your departure runway. I can only let you cross one at a time. So I'm going to say cross runway 3 left, hold short of runway 25. Cross runway 25, hold short of runway 3 left. And that's just what we're required to do these days. Hold short lines. When you get down at the end of the runway, if you're ready to go ahead and pull up to the hold short line. If you're not, pull off into the run-up pad and do your run-up, and then get your sequence at to the hold line. Now, when you clear a runway, you notice the hold line on one side it's solid, on the other side it's dashed. If you're approaching from the dash side, you may cross that line. That line is not there to stop you. It's to stop people from getting onto the runway. It shows us where the runway safety area is. Just being clear of the white line is not enough. If you have heavy aircraft, 767 or bigger, their wingspan is more than 150 feet. So you need to protect for the wings, the wingtip, and the aircraft not exactly being on the center line. We protect, I think, another 200 feet off the end of the runway at Cincinnati. So when you clear the runway, it's your job to make sure the tail of the aircraft is past that hold line. Otherwise, you're considered to still be on the runway. So if you need to taxi onto another taxiway to get clear of the hold line, then that's what you need to do. Keep taxiing. And as you can see, if you don't get clear all the way, the jet landing behind you may take your top off.
Yeah, that's a visual that'll stick with you. That was great. In the course of that presentation, you answered a lot of the questions that came in. I've got a couple follow-ups here on the topic that have also come in from the attendees this evening. One of them is when you are cleared for takeoff and they say maintain runway heading, are they saying to maintain the extended center line, or do they want you to maintain the heading with wind drift? And then is the extended center line, if it is the case, from the approach end, the departure end, or both? Or basically, what's your expectations on the runway heading process and the clearance?
Fly the magnetic heading of the runway.
Simple as
it's
that.
It's up to the controller to apply for drift. At Cincinnati, we have noise tracks that the jets have to hit. If it's not an RNAV departure, then it's the controller's job to adjust the heading that the aircraft flies to stay on that track.
Okay. Even before that point, as you line up at Lunken, for example, or a busy Class D airport, say there's 4 or 5 airplanes lined up ready for the same runway. When you get to that point and you're 4th or 5th in line, what are ATC's expectations? Do they want you to call at that point and say that you're in line, or is it when you're number 1 at the runway, or what's the protocol there?
Yeah, it's a kind of a courtesy thing there. If you see there's a jet coming down the taxiway, you could let the jet go first, but you always have the opportunity to pull out of the run-up pad area and pull up to the hold line, which would make you then number 1 for departure. We expect aircraft that have pulled up to the hold line to be ready for departure. If you're still in the hold up in the run-up area, and you think you're number 1 or you're number 2, just call us and say you're number 2. But don't go further back than that. Don't go saying you're number 4 or number 3. Just, if you're first, we should call you. If we don't, we don't notice you're there, give us a call. So I would say typically if I'm pulling out of the run-up area, I would say I'm ready to go.
Okay, but if you're 4th or 5th back, don't make the call. Wait until you're number 1 for the runway at that point.
Correct.
Okay. Another question came in, and I'm not sure what part of the country it is. And you may want to explain a little bit more about how this works as part of the question. The question was, the pilot said some private towers don't seem to want to coordinate with FAA facilities like TRACONs or ARTCCs after takeoff. So maybe explain a little bit about the private tower concept, and is the private tower behave any differently than a typical federal tower?
Well, I mean, so there are different levels of, there's federal contract towers, there's towers owned by the city, and there are a few that are really just totally private, like Walmart. It just has, it's kind of laziness sometimes, just of the controller, I hate to say it. It doesn't take them that much work to put you in for flight following, and they're just not wanting to do it. So the best thing I can say is, at Cincinnati, it's like you ask for Bravo service. If you ask them for Bravo service, then they have to put you in the system. If you ask for flight following, they're supposed to put you in the system, but it's not for sure. They may just give you our frequency on departure.
Okay, so to clarify, so Bravo service would mean you're requesting a clearance to fly through the Bravo airspace after departure. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then along those lines, a lot of questions came in related to flight following to the smaller towers, the Class D towers. Is it okay? Typically, would you encourage pilots to request flight following in advance with the tower controller versus waiting until you're switched off that frequency and then calling out the approach controller from scratch? On the approach side, what would you prefer pilots do?
Well, we always put the work off on somebody else. So ask for the clearance while you're on the ground, where you're taxiing out, ask for the VFR flight following. It's not that difficult to put you into the system. It just takes a few minutes, but if you're at, if you're busy ground control and you don't have the time to do it, well, you don't have the time to do it. If he doesn't give it to you right away, I'd come back and ask him, hey, did you put us in for flight following? But that's, you might as well get it from the start.
Right.
Instead of waiting.
So everybody knows the plan as far as what's going to happen when you get into the airspace. And that way you're not catching the approach controller for the first time up in the air when things are busier for you as a pilot also. More workload for you as you depart the airport. Switch gears here, arriving at a towered airport, controller tells a pilot to report a 3-mile base. I think there was some questions as the ambiguity of what is the 3 miles based on? Is that based on the center of the airport from the end of the runway, or is it more just a general term, not so much like an instrument, procedure where everything's based on the 1/10 of a mile? But when you hear the term 3-mile base, what are you expecting from the controller standpoint?
Yeah, it's really just a guess on your part, but if you put yourself on your normal base, however far out that is, whether you're setting up to turn a 1/2 mile final, just go 3 miles from the final, and that would be what we would consider to be a 3-mile base. The reason we're asking you to report that is he's going to sequence you at that point. He's going to fit you into his flow of traffic. At a Class D airport, the tower controller does not separate aircraft in the air. He only separates aircraft on the runway. So asking for that report is just for him to, number one, not forget about you, but number two, to get you into the sequence. At that point, he may tell you to follow the aircraft on a midfield downwind. He may have you continue. He may turn your downwind, whatever he needs to do or have you do a 360, whatever's necessary to get you into the pattern at that point. They do a lot of quick thinking in a Class D tower because they don't have the advantage of seeing the aircraft 20 miles away and developing a sequence. It's all of a sudden everyone starts reporting, and he has to work out a sequence.
Okay, one last question here and then we'll move on. This is from a helicopter pilot. If a helicopter pilot's unfamiliar with the arrival airport, what's the best way to request a landing at a specific FBO?
Well, if he's unfamiliar, well, usually we'd like to land aircraft or helicopters usually on the taxiway and not the FBO. It's again, some insurance reasons for the airport, but you might just ask to land on the taxiway that's directly in front of where you're looking to park, if you know where that is. We usually, with helicopters, we want to avoid the flow of fixed wing aircraft. So we'd rather have you go direct to your spot and hold short of, if there's a runway you need to cross on the way, hold short of the runway, and we point out the landing traffic, have you pass behind him, and then go directly to your spot.
Okay, yeah, and that's been my observation too, just as a fixed wing pilot and observing helicopter operations as they get down towards the center of the airport somewhere, and then use a taxiway as like a traditional airplane taxiing into the FBO location.
Now, one neat move we do with some aircraft is if you don't have room for them in the pattern, you have them overfly the airport at 1,500 feet and enter the downwind on the other side of the airport. That just buys you more time. And overhead, the airport's a safe place to be because aircraft should be on the ground at that point.
Yeah, makes sense. Best use of all the available airspace. Okay, we're going to switch gears now over to Class B and C airport operations. And I think this is what gave a lot of concern to both student pilots and VFR pilots. And this is definitely your area of expertise with Greater Cincinnati being a Class B airspace. I'm sure you have a lot of very good advice here. And I want to reinforce again something you said earlier, which is a question that came in many, many times, that it's always, always okay to announce that you, the pilot, are a student pilot, even with your instructor. To give the instructor or to give the controller more awareness about your flight and possibly be a little more patient with you, more helpful instead of rattling off instructions. So again, I want to reinforce that observation and comment from Eddie earlier. So a lot of pilots might not be based in a Class B airspace, but want to come in, especially now, as you mentioned, is a good time to practice these operations as the primary airports are definitely down in traffic due to the airlines cutting back. As a pilot, a VFR pilot coming into Class B airspace, what's the general protocol, or what's the best practices you would give advice to them as far as the entry point, how far to call out, that kind of thing, when they want to do a landing at the main Class Bravo airport in the airspace?
Well, the sooner you call, the better. So approach controls usually control about a 40-mile radius around the airport. The range on the radar is about 60 miles. So somewhere around that 45 mile mark, I would be calling to establish the communications and see how busy we are. If you wanted to land at Cincinnati, then nothing we can do to stop you. We're going to have to fit you into our flow of traffic to bring you into land. Now, if we happen to have a lot of aircraft landing at that time, we can make you go to the end of the line, but we cannot stop you from coming into land. So now if you asked for a touch and go, that would be a different story. So if we were busy, I would ask to come in and land, and then I would taxi back and depart, essentially getting your touch and go, but you got to get your clearance as you're taxiing back to the runway, so you get double experience there. But that would be a good way to get in and out of a busy airport without going to an FBO. If
So
you
that's a good tip there, so that you treat, if somebody called up and said touch and go versus full stop landing, you're going to treat or think about that request two different ways. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There are a lot of Class Bs out there right now that are not that busy. A lot of us lost our traffic back in the 2008. So, a lot more that we can do than other places. Atlanta, LA, those places are never going to have time for you to come in and do something unless it's the middle of the night. So, look at the Class B that you're going to and just see how busy that airport is. There's a good chance we can get you in. We can even do, practice approaches. It's one thing, we got 3 parallel runways. We need 1. So we got 2 runways over there that people can be doing, practice approaches to.
Okay. Let's say a year from now, oh, go ahead. Sorry, I'll let you finish there.
No, I was just gonna say, go ahead with your question. I was gonna talk about transitioning.
Yeah, so say a year from now when traffic does build back up again and a pilot calls and the frequency is busy, what's the difference between Class B and C in terms of the actual clearance phraseology that you have to hear as a pilot to enter Class B versus C airspace?
So C, you just need to establish communications. If I need you to stay outside the Class C, I'm supposed to tell you and remain outside the Class C airspace and give you an estimate of how long it's going to be. In the Bravo, you actually have to be cleared into it. So if you look at that the slide there, that aircraft transitioning through the airspace, you could call me at 8,000 feet and I could never give you a clearance, at which point you would need to descend to remain below the Bravo airspace. So we used to do that to a lot of aircraft going into the satellite airports. If they weren't flying within 10 miles of Cincinnati, we expected you on your own to descend to remain below the Bravo airspace. If you wanted clearance through it, you needed to ask me, I need, request Bravo clearance. It's not highly monitored, that we're looking to catch people that actually hit the Bravo airspace, especially if we're not busy. It's only if you have a close encounter with a jet that then all of a sudden we're going to get concerned.
Yeah, do warning lights go off on your display if VFR traffic penetrates the airspace?
No. In fact, to tell you the truth, most controllers are not real sharp on where the actual Bravo airspace is. It's a map that we can bring up, but we don't keep it up very much. We know basically what altitudes to keep the jets at to keep them in the Bravo airspace, but the actual bottom limits of it, a lot of them are fuzzy on it because, it doesn't really impact us.
So with that being said, then is it detrimental to you or a controller to have a pilot fly above or below the shelf without talking to you, or would you rather still be talking to that pilot if they're flying underneath, let's say, the Class B or C airspace? Would you prefer them to talk to you, or is it better just to do it on your own and not tie up the frequency?
If you're going to go underneath, I would say, probably don't talk to us because we're more likely to push you out further. Going over the top is a little dangerous because say you're going to go at 10.5, you're going to be on top. Well, the jets that are going to enter the downwind are going to be at 11,000 feet until they're 20 miles from the airport, and then they're going to start down. So you're right there where they're transitioning their descent. So I think if I went above the Class B, I would give me I'd ask for radar services.
And so would that be with Greater Cincinnati or the overlying air traffic, the center controller?
Here it would be Cincinnati. We go up to 13,000 feet.
Okay, so your airspace actually that you monitor goes above the vertical limit depicted on the chart then?
Yes, and if the controller is a jerk, you can always say, I'd like to terminate radar service and I'll just continue along VFR at 10.5. Now he knows where you are, and he's responsible to miss you. And TCAS is going to make him do that because if he tries to go over the top of you at 11,000 feet with the jet, the TCAS is going to go off on the airliner, and unless that airliner sees you, they're going to start a climb.
So you just caused a lot of problems, but completely legal, but
yes,
not fun for the jet pilot for sure.
You got even with the controller.
Right. Now, what about some busier airspace where there's a Class D airport located within the boundaries of a surface area of a Class B or C airport? What's the kind of chain of communication at that point? Can you go right to the Class D tower, or do you need to call the overlying approach controller first?
Well, if it is a Bravo, you're going to have to get the clearance to go through the Bravo to get to the Delta unless you go underneath. If it's a Charlie, anytime I can get radar services, I'm usually going to talk to approach control. That would be, the preferred method. Then when you do talk to the Delta, you're going to be on their radar scope. Most Delta towers have a radar scope, so they're going to know who you are and where you are, so they can better sequence you. So that would be the preferred method. I have nothing wrong with going with flight following. The only time you get into trouble is if you're right around, say, within 10 miles of Cincinnati. We've got a block for our departures and our arrivals. We can't mess up their flight path. So if you plan to stay more than 10 miles from Cincinnati, we can usually work you out with no problem at all. When we were really busy, there was a rule that you had to stay 20 miles from Cincinnati if you were an overflight. Now, if you go into a satellite, we still had to figure a way to work you in, but we always took all overflights more than 20 miles away from the airport, because what would happen is you would disrupt a climbing or descending aircraft and they would miss you, but then they would be in the wrong position and they would then conflict with somebody else. So that's why the T routes became developed on the either sides of our Class B airspace.
Okay, that's good to know. So I think and this answers a lot of the questions that we can't get to this evening, but they're along the same theme. Is that in general the controller would prefer to talk to you if you're going to be in there. He likes to know who you are, see you on the scope, identify you, know what kind of airplane you are, which helps him or her bring in the traffic into the main airport, the Class B or C airport.
Now, one of the things we will tell you right away is report prior to altitude change, and that's not trying to assign an altitude to you. It's that just give me a heads up. You're at 4,500. I'm planning my traffic around that. If you now change, then I got to change my plan. So let us know before you change altitudes.
Okay, that's good advice. Let's talk about some en route flying now, away from the terminal area. First question here coming in related to that is filing an IFR flight plan. And let's think outside of the current slowdown with less traffic. But common question, and I hear this all the time from students at our airport and customers: when is it okay to file GPS direct versus doing an airway or a T route, as you alluded to earlier? And what's the kind of best practice there and considerations for that?
You know, if you're lazy, just file direct. There's nothing wrong with filing direct. If we want something different, we're going to give it to you. As I said, back in Cincinnati, you file above 10 and we're going to stick you on a route. It just means you're going to get a full route clearance, which, you know, may or may not be a big deal to you. You can look in the back of the airport facility directory. It gives you some preferred routings. Certainly, if you fly out of the airport a lot, you'll know what the common routings are out of your home airport. But we have no problem with you filing direct. The only problems you can run into is we're only concerned with our immediate world. So I'm concerned about the 60 miles around Cincinnati. Outside of that, I don't know. There could be a restricted area down there. There could be an MOA down there. I don't know, and it's not of concern to me. So if you file from here direct to Tampa, I'm going to give it to you. When you get down to Atlanta, they're not going to let you go over the top of Atlanta. They're going to route you around. So look on your flight plan. If you see that there's a restricted area or a Class B airspace, it would be a whole lot better to just plan to, you know, avoid that area or use the T routes.
And one piece of advice I'll share, just based on my own experience, a lot of the mobile apps now, like ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot and FlightPlan.com, have a basically real-time database of recent clearances issued to other aircraft based on altitude and frequency, and that's a great resource also. So even if you don't know the full route or know why ATC is doing what they're doing, it's going to give you a clue as to what the clearance might be. And if you file that, you're likely to get that, just again because you know that the ATC system in general has accepted and approved that for other aircraft, and that can make your preparation before the flight a lot easier. So when you get the clearance delivery, you don't get that full route clearance that Eddie alluded to. And if you filed out of Cincinnati, for example, above 10,000, you would see those routes in each direction and likely a transition fix, an RNAV transition fix to get you out of greater Cincinnati. Question here is interesting. So let's say you're flying a single engine aircraft over Lake Michigan. Does ATC know, or do they take into consideration or have concern whether or not you have survival gear when you're flying over open water?
No, we do not.
So that's strictly on the pilot at that point.
That's strictly on the pilot, yes.
Okay, and ATC may, if your routing goes that way, they're not going to ask you. They're going to assume that you're comfortable with that situation. So that goes back to
Correct.
you as the PIC to make that decision. So I think you kind of answered this previously, but I'll let you expand more on the center, the way they route traffic. So if I'm flying from here, here being Cincinnati to Kansas, and I'm cleared direct, but then I switch over to Kansas City Center, they give me now a reroute. Why do the centers do that? Why am I good at one point where everything's clear of airspace, clear of restricted areas, and then all of a sudden I get a reroute? What's the reasoning behind that when everything seemed to be fine and now it's making everything much more complicated?
If it's happening on a normal basis, it could be a preferred arrival route. The center before the center that has your destination airport in it is responsible to give the preferred arrival routing into that into the next center's airspace. So when I worked in Knoxville, we got a lot of preferred arrival routings going into Atlanta that we had to give aircraft that were flying through our airspace. So it could be that in the center, you know, I mean, the center just knows its own world. It doesn't know what's going on in the next center. So unless the computer spits something out, they don't get it.
So the computer itself is not necessarily going to look across the entire 2 or 3 centers if you're a high performance airplane in terms of what might be 2 centers away and implications there.
You know, sometimes it has to have triggers there. But I think it's still down to just one center away. Because I know going into Nashville, we were getting arrival routes, but I think that's because it went into Indy Center's airspace.
Okay. Here's a question: if flying in a military operation area, will the controller point out military aircraft as a traffic target to GA aircraft?
They should, and the military may use you for target practice. And that is true. It's happened before. But yes, the controller is supposed to point you out. Of course, if you're IFR, he will not allow you to go in there.
Okay.
You'd have to be VFR.
Oh, yeah, good point. So yeah, maybe if you're on flight following, for example, that could be an example there. For IFR pilots, when they are taken off, say their course to a direct to a fix, RNAV point, etc., via vector, and then the controller says proceed on course while on the IFR flight plan, are they expected to go to the next waypoint or to re-intercept the previous course?
Yeah, that's an example of poor phraseology. He should have said, clear direct to the next fixed. But anytime he says on course, they want you to resume your route, which if you're flying point to point, I would just go to the next point.
Okay, but if in doubt, obviously clarify. Ask the question.
Yes, yeah,
Um,
ask the question. And if we talk too fast, just say again. The controller hears that enough times, he'll slow down.
yeah, that was a common question. I think pilots and me, especially when in my student pilot days and working with students today, have that fear that controllers talk too fast, and if you ask them again, that you're going to get some kind of penalty, or they're going to treat you differently somehow. Should that ever be a concern with pilots to say again, or to ask for clarification, or is it, who's kind of in control at that point?
No, you should. You need, I hate to say it, but in a way you're teaching the controller you need to slow down, because there are controllers that they're not even busy and they're talking fast, and they don't know unless someone says something to them. So yeah, I would certainly say again, or we had one guy said, I'm from Alabama, y'all gonna have to slow down.
There's definitely some regional dialects you hear, flying from New England down to the south, and the south is generally easier to understand than the northeast, that's for sure. Talking about ATC handoffs, we're still in this age of radio communications, and hopefully in the 20 years from now we're doing it electronically. But for now we're still doing the old-fashioned radio handoffs. How does that happen on the controller side? So when you receive a new frequency, what's kind of happening behind the scenes between controllers?
Okay, usually our computer will automatically hand you off to the next sector. If not, we enter a code and slew out to your data block and hit enter, and then your data block starts flashing on the next controller's scope. And when the controller sees it flashing on a scope, he slews out onto the target, hits enter, it stops blinking on his scope, and now it's blinking on the controller that just made the transfer.
So
And
pretty
so,
low workload on the controller's side.
yes, yeah, and there's no workload at all. If you don't see the flash, there's a letter that sits on top of your primary target, and that letter will change. So if I didn't see the flash, I'll see that it's no longer on my letter. It's switched to somebody else's, and then I can just switch them to that frequency.
Now, what about a situation where a controller's working multiple frequencies and they say change to my frequency on 120.6? Uh, is it courtesy for the pilot to then switch the frequency and do a fresh check on, or what's the best practice on that scenario?
Yeah, I would switch to the frequency, and this is your opportunity to use some slang. You can say I'm up, I'm with you. And I know there's a question about the with you. Um, with you is something the airlines like to say all the time for some reason. It sounds cool. But if you're working in an approach control that has a lot of VFR aircraft and someone checks in and they say with you, I assume that I should know who you are. And if you're calling me for the first time, I'm going to waste a lot of valuable time searching for you only to find that I haven't identified you yet. So we prefer not to hear the with you, because if Delta's checking in, he's going to say Delta 247's at 8,000. He's going to give me his altitude, the altitude he's at, and the altitude he's assigned. If you're calling me and you're VFR flight following, you give me your altitude and your assigned altitude, or the altitude you're climbing to. If you're level, just say you're level at 8. But if you're calling for the first time, just say VFR request.
Don't so in that scenario, don't give a ton of information. Just give essential info and let the controller come back to you on his terms.
Yes.
Okay, good. And I think that was a common question as well for a lot of communication scenarios, whether you want to hear the altitude, position, all that stuff. Even now, when the frequency is not as busy, just like you said with the clearance delivery aspect, that controller is not expecting you to come on the frequency, so they're not prepared to absorb all that information and try to find you. So just identify your N number, request, VFR, IFR, whatever it might be, and then let the controller come back to you for more information.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of air traffic that is really boring. You hate to sit in a dark room for hours and only talk to 2 airplanes. I mean, there are not you're not busy all the time. So you may be calling that controller that's half asleep.
Waking him up.
Yeah.
I want to give you an
So
opportunity here to go through some of the kind of behind the scenes aspects of what the controllers are looking at, and I have a series of slides here that come from our Sporty's instrument rating course, a program we collaborated on, but to kind of give pilots who haven't been to a radar facility a little bit of insight as to what you're looking at. So if you want to maybe talk a little bit about each one and give some insight as to what we're looking at.
Okay, so what we're seeing here, the main thing I want you to see here is the weather. So the airport is in the lower middle. You can see the final approach course going to the north. And as you leave the airport, it kind of turns a little blue. A little blue is kind of hard to see, but then there's some dots, and that's a change of weather. The blue is the lightest precipitation. Then we're getting into some moderate. Then as you go further north, the dots get a lot closer together. So we show 6 levels of weather. So those are the first 3. Now, if you look out to the west, you'll see it's kind of brown or mustard color, and it's hard to see the dots that are spaced out. You're seeing the dots that are real close together, and that would be the level 6. So you see how quickly it went from level 1 up to level 6. That tells me that's a thunderstorm, and we've got some real activity going on there. But for the most part, our weather radar only tells us volume of water. So I know that there's heavy precipitation there, or extreme precipitation. That's the way we describe it. We describe precipitation in 4 different terms, and that's because everyone has different levels. The center only has 3 levels of weather. The flight service, I think their radar has like 8 or even more levels of weather. Approach controls usually have 6. If you have the old radar system, you only have 2. And we were all reporting weather as saying, oh, it's a level 2. Well, level 2 varies from facility to facility. So we go light, moderate, extreme. I left out one there. But anyhow, we don't know if there's turbulence in there. There can be extreme precipitation on final, and it could be a smooth ride, which happens a lot in the wintertime. There's a high volume concentration of water out there, and that's what we're getting. So it's up to you as the pilot to look at those clouds and say, I don't want to fly through that. And that's when we really need the pilot report. Yes.
So the weather here we're looking at, what's the source of the data? Is that internet fed, or is that actually from the radar site itself?
That's from our radar itself.
So that's real time then, what you're looking at?
Yes, it is real time. It does jump a little bit, not too much, not like the center. The center can be behind 10 minutes and it can really jump. Ours is fairly accurate, but again, it doesn't show turbulence. In the summertime, we're not even showing precipitation on the scope, and we have airliners asking to deviate because of the clouds, because they're seeing cumulus clouds beginning to develop.
Without the moisture falling down yet, yeah.
Yes.
From your standpoint, as far as what you would drive an aircraft through, if you want to call it that, it's up to the controller's discretion. But would you say more times than not it's on the pilot to request the deviation when you have heavy precipitation, or would you advise them, heavy to extreme of precipitation, 12 o'clock? Is there a point where you would not let the traffic go through that system?
No, there is not, especially on final. I know my job as an arrival controller is to get you on the final. So no matter what is sitting on the final, I am taking you there, and you have to tell me otherwise. Now I am on the way there going to take you away from the heavier precipitation. I'm not going to tell you I am, and that becomes a lawyer question, because if I say I'm giving you a vector for weather and then you run into something and you crash, then they'll say it's my fault. So we usually say vector for sequence, and we vector you away from the heavier stuff. Now, it is real important that we get the PIREPs, that we know what kind of turbulence is taking place, because that's what everyone wants to know, but it doesn't seem like a lot of people want to give the information. I was flying on an air carrier, and we hit a pothole around 10,000 feet. The captain got on the phone and apologized to the passengers, but he never said anything to ATC. Well, 10 miles in trail of us was another air carrier who's going to hit that same pothole. So we need PIREPs. That's one thing we're real big on the controllers right now, is making sure they get PIREPs every hour.
Now, this was a common question that came in also, because Flight Watch is no longer available and flight service is thinning out across the country. So really the main feedback mechanism for pilots to give PIREPs is through air traffic control. But that can be challenging when the frequency is busy. And I think a lot of pilots feel like they're burdening the controller with that data. So is there a way to streamline the report? You know, we're all taught the long method of all the different reporting points, but if a pilot just has, let's say, a bump of severe turbulence or hits a pocket of heavy icing for a couple miles, do they need to give the entire strip of PIREP information, or can they just give you that one little piece of information?
Yeah, just the one little piece. You know, if we're already talking to you, we know your type aircraft. So we just want what you got, moderate icing at 8.
Okay, and you'll
You
put
know,
that in the system then, the PIREP that'll show up then for other aircraft.
yes,
I think that's more important now than ever, especially with ADSB, the FISB side of it, the weather uplink that pilots have access to see pilot reports. And if you look now, if you've been paying attention the last month or so, they've really decreased due to the lack of flying. But I think a lot of pilots in general don't want to bug the controller. And I think the message here is, yes, if you have important information, share it. Don't feel like you're being a burden to the approach controller that you're talking to.
definitely. So this is just showing our radar maps. You can see on the left side, that's the Cincinnati Airport, shows the 3 parallel runways, and then our east-west runway. We have a Class D, and every approach control actually can display things on their maps differently. So you won't find this necessarily at all other approach controls. If it's not a towered airport, we usually don't show the runways. You can see the Sporty's Airport there. We're showing the instrument approach finals to the airport. And then we got the restricted airspace. Actually, it's a MOA out there to the east. But those other dashed lines you see on there are just breaking up the airspace, because that 40-mile radius around the Cincinnati Airport has to be divided up for about 12 other controllers to use, and no one can have the same piece of the pie. Everyone has to have their separate piece, and that's what most of those other lines are for.
I want to break up just for a second here and give everybody a heads up. The presentation was scheduled till 9 p.m. We've got another probably 15, 20 minutes of content. So I encourage, if you have time, to stick around. Again, as I mentioned, if you do have other obligations to get to, given it is 9 o'clock Eastern time, as we said, the presentation would extend to, please check back our Sporty's YouTube channel tomorrow, and you'll be able to watch the remainder of the presentation. But Eddie, if it's okay with you, I'd like to continue on and with the rest of the content.
Certainly.
Great, yeah, appreciate that. Appreciate your time this evening. And so what we have up here next is some call outs on the actual radar tags for aircraft.
So starting in the lower left-hand corner, that L tells me the position that's working the aircraft. And the top line, of course, is the call sign. That splat at the end of the call sign tells me that the aircraft is probably VFR, because he is not getting low altitude alert warning. That is turned off for the aircraft. And if you're flying VFR, we keep it turned off unless you declare an emergency or you encounter IFR conditions, and then we're required to remember to turn it on. Next line information, the altitude there is 2,600. His speed is 110 knots. The P and the F is just something we use at Cincinnati. We're telling Lunken Tower that he's doing a practice approach and he'll be returning to us. The altitude timeshares with a scratch pad. In most cases, we put the destination airport there, but you can put other information. And then we have the type aircraft.
We had a lot of questions come in. We'll use this slide as a kind of a jumping point. January 1st, 2020 was the deadline for ADSB out equipage in most of the same areas that require a mode C transponder. So I think a lot of pilots are interested from a controller standpoint. How has that affected your operations and how you deal with traffic?
Yeah, it's had really no effect on us, other than we've had to endure lots of briefings on ADSB. It only helps us in places where we don't have good radar coverage, and approach controls usually have good radar coverage. It does show up on our data block. The first data block there, ADSB is on, it's working fine. The second one, there's something wrong with the ADSB, they have it, but we're not really getting a good signal on it, so it's an open circle. And then the bottom one, it's filled in, telling us that the aircraft does not have ADSB. And most controllers don't turn this on because we don't care whether or not you have ADSB or not. So if you're flying around Cincinnati, you're going around our class, the mode C veil, and you don't have ADSB, we can clear you into the area without the ADSB.
Are you able to see aircraft type? I think that was a common question. You know, there's more information in the signal itself. Does the controller see that, or does it not really show?
No, we don't get any ADSB information other than position, which is fed through the computer and mixed in with the radar data to give us the best position of the aircraft target. Other than that, the information is there. We just don't access it.
Okay. So I think a lot of pilots were concerned that, the kind of Big Brother aspect, what are you getting more info than previous? But it sounds like it's like you said, the computer behind the scenes is mixing the radar information along with your ADSB position, and it's really a position source. That's the primary goal of it.
Yeah, there's a slide coming up where we show flight aware. Flight aware is getting your information because that ADSB information is going out. This here is a VFR aircraft that departed Lunken, went out and did some maneuvers and came back in and landed. Now it's kind of neat if you're doing practice approaches to kind of look and see what you did, but here was a guy who was just VFR out there flying around. So your data is tracked. In the past, we never would have known who that VFR was, but now we do.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's interesting to see at our flight school, our training flights, we can go out and see and track them, and actually probably have more info just based on the flight aware and the third-party companies that are taking the data and managing it to show with satellite imagery and real-time weather, almost like our own kind of mini air traffic control for the satellite airport. I think there's a point here you want to mention on this slide.
Yeah, but you can go to the FAA and tell them to stop broadcasting your information so that we don't pass it on. You can have your call sign blocked so that your information doesn't go to FlightAware. The point of this slide here was just showing the 60-mile radius around approach controls. You see the blue areas, there's no approach control covering that airspace. Near Cincinnati, there is Fleming Mason Airport, which nobody can see below 4,000 feet, but now with ADSB, we can see down to 1,000 AGL over that airport. So we have better coverage. It's not our airspace, that's actually owned by Indianapolis Center because no approach control had good coverage there. So it's helping us to see aircraft better, but it's usually in outlying areas. So unless you're flying, maybe in the mountainous areas. Currently at Cincinnati, we're not getting satellite information. Everything comes off repeaters that are antennas located around our airspace.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about IFR a little more specific here. Common question was aircraft based at non-towered airports that are nearby, maybe a Class B or Class C airport, where they have to get their IFR clearance remotely. What's your preference? And obviously you deal a lot with our airport, Claremont County Airport, which is a non-towered airport just outside the Class B. But on let's say a VFR day, do you prefer aircraft to get their IFR clearance on the ground via the RCO, or would you rather them depart VFR and pick it up airborne?
It's always nice if you depart VFR and pick it up airborne. Personally, I would call first, while you're taxiing out, just come up on the frequency and say, hey, Cincinnati, it's November 123, do you have my IFR flight plan? I'm going to depart VFR.
And that way you're not holding up the airspace either for void times.
Right, but you make sure then he has the flight plan so that you don't get airborne and find out, oh, I don't have a flight plan because, well, I was off on my timing, or some other error. So I would check to see if it's there, unless it's a good VFR day, and if I can't pick up my IFR, I can continue VFR. If my route of flight was going to be into the Bravo airspace, then I certainly would pick it up before I departed, just so that I wouldn't have to worry about the Bravo airspace, because when you're IFR, you don't need to worry about it.
Okay. Now, what about a day where it's IFR and departing VFR is not an option, but for some reason the RCO is inoperative and you can't get a hold of that controller on that remote frequency? What's kind of the plan B at that point to get your clearance?
Cell phone, if you have it, if you can find our number. And actually, our correct number is in the airport facility directory. So hopefully you have a number you can call.
Yeah, that would be my same advice. And the FAA, I think it was just the end of last year, publishes now all those frequencies, as you mentioned, in the AFD section of the chart supplement. My personal protocol is I have Cincinnati Approach nearly on speed dial because I fly a common IFR out of a non-towered airport. So if I call twice and I don't hear an answer, I go right to the cell phone, and the controllers have always been very accommodating, relaying the clearance over cell phone. So that was kind of my thought. I was curious if there was any other method you've mentioned, but with cell phone coverage being so widespread now, that seems to be the best option. When you take off,
you lose your radio, use your cell phone. Call us.
Yeah, good point. Instead of doing a complete lost comms, you still have a cell phone to make communication with the controllers. When you take off from the non-towered airport, and you are calling up, a lot of pilots want to know what kind of accuracy you need to report your position just off of the airport, so that the controller can identify you.
It's real general. It's just to get us looking in the right direction. You could be 5 miles off; it wouldn't really matter. The way I'm going to identify you is I'm going to see your beacon code change. I'm going to see the 1200 code change to the code I assigned, or I have you ident. A lot of people, when they put a new code in, they automatically ident. It's fine. It doesn't really matter. I just got to see a code change, and then I know that's you.
Okay, so just a general location. It doesn't need to be real specific on a radial or a DME distance.
Right. Yeah. I'm north of Claremont County, and I see a target. Okay, it's good enough. Now, if you're when you use a fix, you use a good fix. I mean, don't use some sort of waypoint. I'd rather you say you're 30 miles northeast of Cincinnati than to say you're 4 miles north of Woohoo, because
Sure.
I'm busy trying to figure out where's Woohoo.
Yeah, pick a major airport. Okay, now when you're established at altitude, leaving the airspace, you're assigned, let's say, 3,000 feet. What's your criteria? Let's say it's turbulent and I'm having a tough time maintaining altitude. What's the criteria, as far as I'm given before I don't want to say in trouble, but before, a siren or a warning goes off on your controller screen for an altitude deviation?
Well, I'm not going to get a warning unless you're near another aircraft. And your mode C can be off 300 feet, well, actually 299 feet. So unless I'm issuing traffic to you, you're probably okay. Because if you're getting, within 1,000 feet of another aircraft, I should be exchanging traffic to you.
Okay. I think again, the common concern here was a lot of pilots were again worried about what their tolerances are in terms of before ATC is going to write them up or give them a phone number to call for one-time altitude deviation.
Yeah, we have a electronic snitch that goes off, and that happens a lot with aircraft. You're flying along at 8,100 feet. Somebody coming the other way is at instead of being at 9, they're at 8,800 feet, and it goes off as a loss of separation. But
Okay.
as long as your mode C has been there for a while, it can be off 300 feet.
Is that a required report from you as a controller at that point?
No.
Okay, so it's still your discretion then whether or not you need to take further action.
Yeah, and I mean and if you're off on your mode C, the controller, he's going to give you the altimeter. It's the first thing he's going to give you. And so while you're dialing in the altimeter, you say, "Yep, that was what it is. Hey, I'm level at 9."
Gotcha. This kind of circles back from what we were talking about earlier with practicing approaches, but more from an IFR standpoint. Again, given the reduced traffic, it's a good opportunity for pilots to do that at different airports. But when practicing instrument approaches, do you, the controller, prefer them to file an IFR flight plan, a round robin flight plan back from the originating airport back there, or would you prefer them to not mess with the IFR system and just call it VFR and request practice approaches that way?
Well, we prefer you to do practice approaches VFR just because the separation is reduced while you're in the pattern. So that kind of gives us a little more flexibility. But if you need to go IFR, most controllers will, say you took off, you're going to do VFR practice approaches, you get up there and all of a sudden the ceiling's in the bad place, so you need to go IFR. Just ask for a local IFR and he could just make you IFR.
And that's a pop-up clearance at that point, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And is that a lot of workload for the controller to do a pop-up clearance, or is that pretty straightforward?
No, not at all. All I'm going to do is slew out to your data block and give you MSAW processing and say, okay, you're cleared to be a radar vectors, maintain 3,000.
Because you already have all the information. You have a squawk code, you have the aircraft type. So it's just
right,
a transit.
and you've already identified.
Okay. Same thing along the student pilot lines. If you have a private pilot working on their instrument rating, would you have any issue, or would you prefer them actually to identify them as a student instrument pilot, if you want to call it that, again, to kind of help the controller understand their level of skill while practicing the approaches?
It never hurts to say student pilot. If the controller's talking fast, I would come back and say student pilot, say again.
Got it. So yeah, I think that's a good message, even if you're already a private pilot, but just to give them the insight that you are practicing approaches as a newer instrument pilot at that point. Another question coming in. if you're on an IFR clearance, it's VFR at the destination, you have the airport in sight. We'll assume this is a non-towered airport destination. Does it make your life any easier for them to cancel IFR and just go VFR, or to stick with you all the way to the non-towered destination, again, given its VMC conditions?
Well, yeah, we'd prefer that you'd cancel IFR in the air, just because if you don't, I need to keep your data tag on the airport so I don't forget I'm waiting for the cancellation of your IFR flight plan. And that's something, if it's, it's great VFR, yeah, I'll do that. But if there's any chance anything could go wrong, nighttime or whatever, I'd just wait and cancel on the ground.
Okay. So yeah,
For
that
your
makes
own safety. I mean, because once you cancel IFR, if you were to crash, no one's looking for you.
sure. Okay, let's talk about flight following a little bit. We talked about a little bit of this earlier. And flight following to me is kind of a gray area because it's not specifically described in the AIM. And so I guess first off, kind of give some of this you've already alluded to as far as controller would like to know the position and know who the aircraft are. But what's kind of your general feel on flight following and an aircraft that's going to leave your airspace, leaving Cincinnati and heading towards Indianapolis or Columbus? Again, do you prefer to know who that traffic is, or would you rather not have to deal with not to say the hassle, but the extra workload of dealing with the traffic?
Well, we get paid based on how many aircraft we work, so it's good to work VFR flight following because it does count. Even if you're just going from one airport to another that's only 15 miles apart, I'm going to get a count for you departing the one airport and then another count when you land at the next airport. So I get a 2 count in that situation. So you'll find that terminals are more apt to give flight following than the centers. The centers usually don't want to be bothered with it. They're already making big bucks. They don't need to increase their traffic count any. Whereas terminals, the more aircraft we get, the more money we get. So we're fine with working you. Altitude sometimes becomes a problem because you are getting further away from us. So you should be at least at 3,500 feet, especially if you're ever going to talk to the center, just to make sure you stay in radar contact with them. That could be a little different now that we have ADSB. But yeah, the sooner you request it, the better. And you're going to get better service at a terminal. Center may not even issue traffic to you, but at least they're watching you. And if something ever goes wrong, you're talking to somebody.
And I think you mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but if you do need to make an altitude change, should the pilot advise the controller, or legally, can you make the altitude change without advising? What's kind of the best practice on that scenario?
Yeah, unless he's assigned the altitude to you, it's just a courtesy. You're going to change altitudes, and we already have someone at the altitude you're climbing to. It'd be nice for you to know that ahead of time. So I would advise us prior to climbing. And if you're going to turn more than 15 degrees to avoid clouds, let us know. But small deviations we're never going to notice.
And is there a difference then also in the types of flight following? So I know sometimes when I've done this, the radar service is terminated right when leaving the Cincinnati airspace versus that being handed off to the next facility. Is that a different setup in how you set up the aircraft in your system to be able to allow that handoff to the next center or approach control?
Yeah, it's the beacon code I gave you. If I gave you 04 something, then that code's only good in our airspace. We did have an agreement, I think, with Columbus for a while where we could actually hand you off to them, but it needs to be a different code in order for me to hand you off. I could do a manual handoff where I actually call the next approach control and tell them exactly where you are. But I can't do an automated one unless you're on the proper code.
And some of that might be workload dependent also.
Yes. Yeah, if you wanted flight following, I should have changed your beacon code. Here's a situation where someone wants to depart below the Class B airspace. He's departing India 67, and he wants to go southbound. And Cincinnati's landing to the south. You see just north of the airport, you see 2,400, and then north of that, 4,000. Those are the altitudes for the glide slope. So you may be looking at the altitudes there and seeing, well, just east of Claremont County, just east of India 67, Class B starts at 3. So I could truck along there at 2,900 feet, and I would be below the Class B, and I would be legal. And that I would say, yes, you would be. However, the glide slope's at 4. but we have parallel runways, which means one aircraft is being turned on at 4,000 and somebody else for the parallel runway is being turned on at 3,000. And if that guy happens to be a 747, you might encounter some wake turbulence. We do have problems with aircraft going underneath the final, setting off the TCAS on aircraft. And as I said earlier, if the airliner can't see you, he reacts to your TCAS and he climbs. So I would try to stay 500 feet below the Class B for sure, if not lower. Now, so a couple different ways to get around here. If you go to the next slide, plan A might be to go eastbound at 2,500 feet till you get to the A there. And if you're going more to the southeast, head over the top of Lunken. Now, that brings up a question. Lunken's Class D airspace. Do I got to get permission to transition the airspace? Well, if you're not talking to Cincinnati Approach Control, then yes, you've got to get permission to go through Lunken's Class D. If you've already called us and established radar contact, it's our responsibility to point you out to Lunken Tower to transition their airspace. So my plan would be I would depart eastbound, stay at 2,500 feet or lower until I got past the finals, and then I would call Cincinnati Approach Control and ask for flight following. If I was going directly southbound, once I got to A, I would go ahead and turn southbound and I would stay at 2 or 2,500 feet. There is some antennas near downtown, so you just need to be alert to those. If you're going, if you want to go around the west side, you could just stay at 2,000 feet and just transition down the west side of Cincinnati. We don't typically land that runway except late at night. So departures would be coming off westbound, but they would be well above you. All jets climb really good. So departure wise at 2,000 feet, you would be fine. And once again, if I went at 2,000 feet, I would wait till I was at Beam Cincinnati before I called, because if I radar identified you north of Cincinnati, I might vector you out to the west. And if you want to stay on course, just stay down there at 2 till you get past us.
That's a great example.
I hope that makes sense.
That's a great scenario, and that's what we deal with based at Claremont County on the east side is when we want to go west and how to transition the airspace. A lot of times, like you're saying, staying 500 feet below the lower limit is the most efficient method on the busier days. Otherwise, you'd be intersecting the arrival traffic southbound, and that's good advice too. The 500 feet below, because that was a common question. You know, am I legal? Yes, to stay just 100 feet below the boundary or 100 feet above, but give yourself some margin. Just for the tolerances of your mode C transponder, but consider that wake turbulence factor. And Greater Cincinnati, I see 747s coming in routinely now, and 500 feet is probably still cutting it close if you were to fly underneath one of those bigger aircraft coming in from Europe, freight aircraft coming in. Just one last subject matter, and we'll wrap up. Again, I appreciate everyone sticking around, and Eddie, for your time this evening. This is great. This is like a flight review for me personally, and hearing all this, I'm sure the pilots as well, that can't get out and fly as much over the last couple of months to have all this great information and insight into all this. So really appreciate your time. We've identified the skill identification earlier many times. We'll repeat again. Definitely but declare yourself a student pilot, declare your skill level, helps the controller. For the fast talking controllers, don't be afraid to say again. You're the pilot, you need to get your communication heard. So don't let them intimidate you. And again, you could be a wake up call to that controller that you need to have communication spoken more slowly and more understandable to you. We had a lot of questions come in, not a lot, but several related to pilot deviations. And you mentioned earlier that you're not obligated to report, say, an altitude deviation or something minor. But if something does happen, like a clearance violation, where you give the phone call to the pilot, what are your expectations at that point in that scenario?
Okay, so the pilot deviations that we're going to have to report, anytime you cross a runway incursion's got to be reported. Other than that, it's usually when you have affected somebody else, caused a loss of separation between two aircraft. So we are required to tell you, give you what's called the Brasher warning to advise you that a possible pilot deviation, and we give you the number to call us. And the reason we have to give that to you is because, 2 months from now, when FSDO calls you, you're not going to remember what happened unless we said that. So you call us, and basically we want your name, your license number, and a good phone number for FSDO to be able to reach you. Other than that, we don't need anything else from you. It's going to be up to FSDO at that point as to what happens. And not all pilot deviations, something happens to you. A lot of times they're learning lessons. So if you took off in your Cessna and for some reason right after departure you hung a right turn, and you weren't supposed to, you were supposed to fly runway heading, we wouldn't think anything of that. However, when an air carrier does that, all of a sudden we're like, okay, why did this guy do this? And you might think this is just a 1 in a million thing, but that's happening in other places in the country. When we came out with RNAV departures at first, there was a lot of situations where aircraft were getting the wrong first fix. So when an aircraft departs now on an RNAV departure, we have to say the first fix if they're departing from parallel runways. And that was because we had aircraft turning into each other. And we thought, oh, it's just here in Cincinnati. Well, no, it wasn't. It was other places. So we're more lenient usually on GA aircraft. If you do something weird, okay, we don't think a whole lot of it. But jet aircraft and air carriers, we're more likely to dig a little deeper because it shouldn't be happening.
But it could lead to something systematic that could be improved, as you mentioned in that previous example. Final question I'll ask, and we'll wrap up for the evening, related to emergencies. And I think this is a very important point. And again, we briefly talked about at the very beginning. And the pilot should not be fearful to tell ATC about a situation or a problem, even if ATC may not fully understand the system or the avionics incident involved. I think a lot of pilots want to go in that scenario as far as possible without declaring an emergency at times. So the kind of question is, what's the best way to ask for priority when you have a situation, but it's not quite to the level of declaring an emergency?
Well, first is telling us that you have something wrong. You don't have to declare an emergency. We'll declare the emergency for you. But if we don't know that you have a problem, we're not giving you any assistance. So you need to be truthful and just let us know, what the problem was. I'm flying on my iPad because my instruments have all crapped out on me. And we had a citation that did that. And the guy descended down to 2,000 feet. He's below the minimum vectoring altitude. And we're like screaming at him to climb back up. And he's like, oh, you don't understand. I was like, no, we didn't understand. And what had happened was he got down to 2,000. He got VFR. He wanted to stay there. He didn't want to go back up in the clouds. But, we don't know what's going on unless you tell us. And the controller may not be able to help you, but if you tell him what's wrong, he can say to the supervisor, those around him, what the problem is, and then we can find somebody that maybe can help you. Giving somebody priority is no big deal, happens all the time. I'd say at least once a week when we were busy, we had an aircraft come in with a medical emergency or, any kind of little emergency, and we give them priority. It's not a big deal.
That's great advice, and I think that's one of the takeaways I've learned working with you over the years is to be honest and disclose anything, and don't have any other concerns about getting the aircraft safely on the ground. And that's the controller's mission as well, and to work together as a team with the controller and not be fearful or concerned about what the repercussions are. Eddie, again, thank you very much. This has been incredible. Appreciate your insight on all this, and I hope we gave the viewers and attendees this evening a wealth of information across pretty much every aspect I can think of as far as ATC, from terminal operations and route, IFR, VFR procedures, etc. I have some information up here for some more information. The NATCO website, the quick guides, which are some communications pamphlets, very nicely done, 2 sides, each one, airspace, weather, communications tips at non-towered airports, etc. There's one dedicated to flight following, which I would recommend also for those interested in more information on that. Of course, Sporties, we have our VFR and IFR communications courses, which will detail specifically, and a lot of questions came in that we didn't have time to get through the exact scenarios, but what is the exact phraseology from start to finish to leave a Class D airport? And we have the controller communication and the pilot communication. So great scenario-based training you can check out there at sporties.com/discover. Liveatc.net, a great modern resource to tune in and listen to active communications at busy airports all across the country. I think one of the best ways to learn about phraseology is just to listen to it. It's a different kind of language, and the more you can expose yourself to it on the ground, especially now and the times we're not flying as much, I think that's very helpful. And combine kind of two things at once. You know, especially now, you can stay socially distant at airport viewing areas in your car. Greater Cincinnati Airport here has an awesome viewing area, overlooks the runways, the airports, the freight operations, even has a playground. I think they added last year or so for children. Don't want to use that right now, obviously, but long-term playgrounds at the airport are a really cool thing. But go out and sit in your car with a radio, a handheld radio, and listen to the communications. That's again a great way to learn the phraseology, but still stay in touch with aviation and the airports in general when we can't fly. Eddie, any concluding comments you want to make to the audience tonight?
We're on your side. We want to see you land safely. Believe me, no one wants to be involved in an accident. So just tell us how we can serve you. That's why we're here. We're actually here to serve you. You know, we like to get paid too, but our job is to be there for you. I appreciate you guys having me on tonight.
Eddie, thanks again, and on behalf of the entire Sporties team, thanks for spending your evening with us. For all the attendees, again, this recording will be up on our Sporties social media channels, including YouTube, probably tomorrow mid-morning or so. And with that, have a great evening, and hope to see you and hear you up in the air soon. Good night.